We're ready to go. And as you are aware, we're doing this at a special time today because today is, among other things, No King's Day. And I just want to give the immediate background. Today is actually the 250th anniversary of the founding of the Continental Military at the beginning of the Revolutionary War. It also happens to be the 79th birthday of Donald Trump. And it turns out that in 2017, Donald Trump attended a military parade in France and was very impressed with the way the French mark Bastille Day with tanks and troops in the streets and planes flying overhead. And he came back here and said that he would like to do something similar in the United States. And it turns out that his then defense secretary said in a meeting at the Pentagon that he'd sooner drink acid than have a military parade in Washington, D.C. He said, look, this is the kind of thing that they do in Russia and China and North Korea. This is what authoritarian regimes do to intimidate their own populations. This is not what we do. Our military speaks for itself on the battlefield. We don't need it parading down the streets of our capital. And it turns out that Donald Trump didn't let go, but he lost that battle as the civilian as well as the military leadership of American armed forces refused. And so here we are in 2025 on June 14th, and we're going to have a major military parade tonight in Washington, D.C. It kind of looks like the gods aligned, right? The birthday of the president and the founding of the American military, but maybe not so fast. There are also predictions of severe thunderstorms in DC. So who knows what will actually happen? It may quite literally rain on the president's parade. But having said all of that, I want to put this parade and then the protest designed to coincide with it on so-called No King's Day in a broader context. And that context particularly unfolds in Los Angeles and Minnesota today and this week. And it is a atmosphere of militarization of civilian authority to stifle dissent, the protest against what I think many of us rightfully regard as Trump's abuse of power and his abuse of his mandate, that he's going much further than the American people authorized him to do or the law allows him to do. And in a democratic society with a culture of liberty and respect for plurality of political opinions, when we don't agree with a president, in particular when we think he's abusing the power vested in his office, yes, we engage in protests. And as Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who very often disagreed on things, both maintained in different ways, this kind of unruly, contestatory politics is the price of the preservation of liberty. It is a sign of democratic health. The effort to intimidate or to bring state violence to bear against the people who practice it is a sign that the elected officials of the United States have lost faith in democratic freedom and liberty and want to do their best to extinguish it, right? And so this is the context in which these protests are occurring. And as if we needed any more reminder that these are dangerous times, that on the one hand, when the tremendous machinery of executive power is used to stifle and intimidate political freedom. Political freedom is fragile. It is sustained by norms not by law alone. And those norms need to be upheld by everyday Americans, but also by our officials, especially the people who exercise, on the one hand, leadership, right? And who we look to model for us constitutional fidelity and patriotism. And on the other hand, people in whom we invest great trust and power, when they use that trust and power against freedom, against their opponents, against the right of their opponents to articulate their dissent and to check illegal actions, we invite violence. And we see this in the rhetoric that comes out of the White House and this administration. And tragically, we saw it in Minnesota this morning with two major political figures in the Democratic Party assassinated. I believe last time I checked, the suspect is still at large. This is chilling. This is tragic, and in the same time, this is unfortunately all too predictable. It's not just the suggestion that in the United States we face an insurrection, an insurgency, an invasion. The extremism of the vocabulary is inflammatory, but it is also the effort to divide America into us and them, into friend and enemy, which we saw in the president's address at Fort Bragg at the beginning of the week. The idea that the people who dissent from the president's political agendas aren't just his political opponents, but enemies of the American people. We have to remember that there are always unstable people among us, people who might do violence. They are on the left and they are on the right and they are in the middle. We don't need to fan the flames of political violence. When we do, all too often the embers catch, the flames spread, and tragic events like what occurred today happen. So this is the broad, right, organizing rubric I want to speak with you about today. I have to detour for just a moment, and I think you know why, right? Because in addition to our focus on American politics at a moment when our democracy appears to be as brittle as it has been, as political violence surges, as the president mounts a growing effort to intimidate political dissent, apparently turning the page to the next chapter of the autocrat's playbook, we also have a major war breaking out in the Middle East, and we will have to see how far this goes. But you may have seen, my maps are not up to date, that Israel increased the scope of its attack on Iran earlier today, going from attacks that aim to decapitate its military command structure, attacks that apparently have been very successful, and attacks on its nuclear infrastructure as well as its nuclear scientists. Again, the attacks on the nuclear scientists appear to be remarkably successful. They may have killed 9 more of the leading nuclear scientists, the people without whom Tehran probably cannot continue to pursue its effort to enrich uranium and possibly acquire nuclear weapons. The effort to take out the Iranian nuclear infrastructure, the enrichment facilities, the stockpiles, appears to be less successful. And probably that is a limit in both the capacity of airborne warfare to damage the infrastructure and of the willingness of the Israeli military to risk spreading nuclear waste across Iran and the region if it hits a fuel source and it gets airborne. You have the equivalent of a dirty bomb. But in addition to all of that, Israel today began attacking the Iranian energy oil infrastructure, right? And really hitting at the heart of the Iranian economy and the support for the regime. And so I don't know how Tehran will respond. I have two maps on the board here. I recognize they're not well differentiated, but I have a map of the sites in Iran that have been hit and of the region as a whole. And as you can see, Iran is the largest society on this map, both territorially and in terms of population. It also has the largest military in the region. And then we have down here, really postage size, Israel, right? And Israel, which is already militarily occupied in Gaza and in other conflicts on its borders, Lebanon and somewhat so in Syria as well, is now attacking its much larger neighbor. The missiles are falling in Israel. This is the second map, right? In Tel Aviv and other parts of the country, Iranian missiles do seem to be penetrating the Iron Dome, getting through the Israeli defenses. I will speak with you on another occasion. I don't want to concentrate here today. I'm not prepared to do so about this conflict, as well as what's happening in Gaza, as well as what's happening in Ukraine, as well as what's happening in Sudan. And as I say that, maybe we need more than one class to unpack all of that. But the idea that conflict, violence, war, seem to be spreading in 2025, and that there are humanitarian catastrophes unfolding in Gaza, in Ukraine, and Sudan, maybe starting now also in Iran and Israel as war spreads. And the question of whether or not we are entering an increasingly anarchical period in international relations, whether or not the United States, to the extent that it had some capacity to keep some of these conflicts from boiling over in the past, has lost that capacity or lost the interest or the focus in doing so. Topic for another day, but I didn't want to let this pass and just call our attention to what is, I think, a very concerning development, not only because we have the two most sophisticated and largest militaries of the region going to war against each other, but because there is the likelihood that this war can spread. This war can spread via the so-called Arab Street, that is to say, to the extent that the people of the region have sympathy for Iran, their sectarian conflicts notwithstanding, and also the possibility that the United States might be drawn into this as well. I think this is something we've got to be focused on in addition to everything else we need to be focused on. The other news of the day, and I'm going to be, with apologies, quite brief about this as well, is that two politicians from Minnesota were shot this morning. State Representative Melissa Hortman and her husband were killed. State Senator John Hoffman and his wife are in harm's way. I think they successfully have come out of surgery, and there's some good chance that they will survive. It appears that it is the same individual who targeted them for political assassination in a deeply divided state, as we are a deeply divided country. And I'm just going to be very brief about this. This is tragic. This is awful. This is what happens when our capacity to resolve our differences via democratic discourse breaks down, when we are so polarized that we treat each other as enemies and animals. We can rationalize political violence against those with whom we disagree. And just to be clear, right, we have a growing wave of political violence in the United States. It comes from all sectors. I'll get into this in a second. There is more of it on the right than there is on the left, but it's coming from both places. And we have growing threats, in particular on our elected officials. I tried to get data that went back further, but showed this with clarity. What I think this data neglects is that 2022 was much higher than 2021, was much higher than 2020. If we saw this in a longer term, I think we would recognize that it is increasingly common for our elected officials to be threatened. As the U.S. Senator Lisa Murkowski put it the other day, all of us are scared. I will get into another U.S. Senator who found himself in harm's way in just a few minutes. But we can see that supports for authoritarianism and for political violence are rising rapidly in the United States. Again, I'm being really quick about this to get into other stuff. That there are large portions of Americans who think that violence is justified when they are unable to prevail politically, who mistrust our institutions and their rivals so much that they think they may be justified in taking power by force. We treat each other across partisan lines in ways that dehumanize and stereotype each other, treat each other as evil and animalistic because of our partisan differences. In this climate, discourse is increasingly unproductive. We don't learn from the other side. We are unwilling to manifest a civil attitude and concede reasonableness to the other side. And the result is that discourse, rather than helping us to bridge our differences and learn from each other, merely inflames our animosity and makes it, frankly, more likely that we're going to do political violence. And then I will just add very quickly that there's this whole literature on social media and what social media does to our discourse and our views of each other. It is a powerful instrument for disinformation. It segregates us in communities of like-minded people that lead us to believe that only people like us are reasonable, and that the only reason to disagree with people like us is because you are corrupt or vile or immoral or dangerous. In other words, it leads us to stereotype and dehumanize each other. And then, by the way, the language of the social media sphere, and in particular, the right-wing quadrants of social media and the so-called manosphere, much of which starts with mixed martial arts and worldwide wrestling, and areas that are designed to be entertaining in their performance of violence. The language of this media system is coarse, is mean, is bullying and brutalizing, and yes, it's violent. And so when we put all of this together, the background conditions that support violence, political violence in the United States in the middle of the 21st century are extremely potent. It is frankly unsurprising that we get political violence in America in the 21st century. Now, let me turn from that specifically to Los Angeles and to the deployment of the National Guard and Marines in Los Angeles to supposedly reinforce and protect immigration customs enforcement officers who are doing deportation sweeps. This started about 10 days ago, June 6th, but it's escalated recently. And then I hope it appears some calm has been restored in Los Angeles. But I want to think about this from a number of vantages. I want to start from the changing tactics in the deportation operations of the Trump administration. And so this has recently come to light that there's been a change in the target of deportation operations away from agriculture and hospitality and certain other service sectors where the word has gotten back to the administration that the deportation sweeps are actually interfering with businesses that are vital to the American economy, that if the deportations continue, they may disrupt the capacity of these sectors to provide the goods and services we rely on and may contribute to inflation, right? And so part of what we saw in Los Angeles over the last 10 days is a change in tactics, a change in targets. And I'll just add very quickly, right? I believe this was deliberately targeted to be provocative, to inflame, to draw protest, and to create the optics of anarchy and political violence. That the ICE troops, I'm sorry, they're not really troops, right? They're merely officials within one of our federal executive agencies, but they came in, right, wearing fatigues and body armor, toting rifles and tear gas canisters and guns, and so-called stun or flash grenades. They came in armed the way the troops of an authoritarian regime would come in to break up a protest, but they were going after unarmed, right, people at their workplaces, at Home Depot, at Target, at various garment manufacturing and distribution facilities. And I'm going to try to label this as part of the politics of fabricating a permanent emergency. The idea that on the one hand, the kind of president Donald Trump wants to be, a strongman autocrat, is, as we know, referring back to Hannah Arendt, the kind of president who people tend to prefer, the kind of leader people tend to prefer during what they regard as emergency times. And by the way, please note that American legislation has various emergency provisions in it that allows the president to exercise extraordinary power to bypass the normal checks and balances on his power, the normal rights of the people that he targets in the advent of a genuine emergency. So if the president can either validate the claim that we're in a genuine emergency or fabricate the impression that we're in an emergency, the greater the likelihood is that he will get support in using extraordinary power and maybe even legal authorization that withstands the scrutiny of the judiciary in exercising that power. Having said that, I want to be as clear as possible about this. We know that when riots and violence swept Los Angeles in 1992, when the police officers who beat Rodney King were acquitted in their trial, 63 people died. Hundreds of blocks of downtown Los Angeles were swept up in violent riots and protests. Businesses were burned. And we know, as opposed to that, what happened 10 days ago in Los Angeles was dominantly peaceful protest. But please note, for instance, what happened in one of the communities that the ICE agents went into is right, that they went into a community that is 80% Latino, where a large portion of the population is undocumented, where many of these people have lived in this country 10, 20, 30 years and have done so without ever breaking the law and in ways that contribute to their society, that they have citizens who they're married to, citizens who are children, that they are related to many citizens, part of churches and other institutions in their society. And when you bring people into those communities, it's likely going to be the case that there are going to be protests, and those protests are going to be heated. That is in part what I believe the administration was deliberately courting, given who they targeted, given how they came in. And I'll just note very quickly, right? 7 journalists have been injured in the scrums that resulted, have been injured by being hit by munitions fired by federal officials. And then we bring in 4,000 National Guard. By the way, without authorization or consultation from the governor or the local officials, when the Los Angeles police really do seem to have this situation completely under control. So the idea that we can differentiate a genuine emergency from a fabricated emergency, that this is a fabricated emergency, that this is a fabricated emergency that is being manufactured for reasons of political expediency, I think all of that is essential to understand about what's happening in Los Angeles and about the militarization of response to civil disobedience and protest politics. Having said that, I also want to try to put this in a broader political context and to try to explain why it's happening now. And I'll be direct and simple. This is something we spoke about last week. This has a lot to do with the president being in trouble in terms of the centerpiece of his domestic legislative agenda and in terms of his popularity overall. The one big, beautiful bill, the more it is scrutinized by members of Congress, or a dozen of the people in the House who voted for this bill now say they would not have voted for it if they knew what was in it. A large number of senators are taking out their scalpels and indicating which parts of the bill they want to see excised. And by the way, they're at cross purposes. Some of them want to see greater savings and either fewer tax cuts or more cuts to various entitlements and benefits, whereas other senators want to see better provision of Medicaid and other kinds of benefits that the big, beautiful bill already cuts in the version that's passed the House. All that to say, the president has a very difficult time in getting this legislation passed, and to the extent that he gets it passed, it seems quite likely that there's going to be a pronounced political backlash against it, given that it hurts the very people who are his most important constituents, working class, less educated, less affluent Americans. And if that's what we're talking about, it's a really bad week for the president. But as opposed to that, if we're talking about immigration, anarchy, lawlessness, the restoration of order in restive and unruly blue cities, the president feels like he's on stronger terrain. And by the way, not accidentally. I just want to call our attention to this recent poll from Gallup. And I think this is important to bear in mind. I've got some of the details in the bottom slide I won't go into as much. But as you can see, over the last 5 or so years, the number of people who think that there are too many immigrants in the country and that we need to decrease the number has almost doubled. It is a clear majority, and it doesn't necessarily show any signs of slowing this movement against immigration in American politics. And I think we have to be honest that Joe Biden's lackluster enforcement of immigration law on the southern border, combined with a broken immigration system in which we don't have the judges or the officials to carry out timely deportations when people enter the country without authorization, the fact that we don't have a rational system for determining how many people our country actually needs and for providing legal pathways for them to get here to fill important roles in our economy. All of this has contributed to this sense that cities are being overrun, that the people who are arriving, too many of them arrive without authorization and without scrutiny, and that some of them may be dangerous to our society. I don't want to pretend that this is all rationally motivated. I think much of this is inflated by the right-wing media system we were talking about just a few minutes ago, by the circulation of images on social media, by the exaggeration of the significance of some particular stories and narratives that are tragic and that are awful, but that are not typical. So having said all that, the idea that if Donald Trump can shift the narrative of American politics away from his big, beautiful bill, its priorities, its legislative prospects, and into a battle in the street over whether or not his government is going to be able to deport the people it has labeled as criminals and dangerous and here illegally, is him trying to get back onto what he considers to be safer terrain. And I will just add very quickly two more pieces to this puzzle. The first is whether or not you believe what I've just said to you, right? Which is, among other things, that the protests in Los Angeles were dominantly peaceful and orderly, that there were isolated pockets of violence, some of it sponsored by people who have, I think, anarchical fantasies that if they light enough Venmos on fire, if they throw enough rocks at the immigration and customs enforcement officials, they're going to start a revolution. Those people, they're there. They're real. You can capture them on social media. And if, by the way, you play the images of the burning cars, of the flying rocks and Molotov cocktails on an endless loop in your media system, you can get people to believe that what was exceptional, extraordinary, isolated, and not typical of what was happening in Los Angeles is really representative. That Los Angeles is in 2025 what it was in 1992, or to go back to more recent memory, that the Black Lives Matter protests of the summer of 2020, which again were misrepresented in right-wing media as being more anarchic, violent, and dangerous than they actually were, are returning. And we need a strong president to suppress them. And so I have on the board my favorite Magritte painting, at least one of them, right? This is not a pipe, which the actual title of is The Treachery of Images. And this is just to point out, right? We know this is canvas covered in pigment. This is not a pipe, but try as we can, when we look at it, we don't see canvas and pigment. We see a pipe. Our brains fool our minds into believing that images that we see in a certain way are as they are or are representative. And in the media environment of the 21st century, a little bit of lawlessness, a little bit of violence can be easily manipulated and turned into the pretext for believing that we are in the middle of a permanent emergency. So again, this is part of fabricating an alternative narrative to get us talking about what Trump wants us to be talking about and not about his big, beautiful bill. just to point out, this is one of several fabricated emergencies we have. We have supposedly an invasion from Venezuela, which many courts have looked at now and determined is not, in fact, an invasion and is not, in fact, sponsored by the Venezuelan government. We have a supposed economic emergency, which again, the economic data suggests is anything but an emergency. In fact, we're in better conditions than we have been for a very long time. And so the invocation of emergency international economic powers under the IEPA legislation to impose tariffs is another example of this. And then we have what Donald Trump said at Fort Bragg, that we have an insurrection, that we have an invasion, that our enemies are trying to counter what the American people want done. This is dangerous rhetoric. And there is a darker underside to this, which I want to get to in a minute. But first, please notice, right, that Donald Trump's approval rating has sunk more in the last week than it has done at any point in his presidency, and that what appears to be dragging him down, among other things, is the unpopularity of the big, beautiful bill. It does have majority support from Republicans, and that may look fairly robust and impressive until you compare it with things like the Inflation Reduction Act. And part of what you should know about the Inflation Reduction Act is that its support was over 90% from Democrats, its opposition less than 5%. So this bill is actually not as popular with Republicans, well, as you would expect it to be if they were making their minds up purely on the basis of partisan loyalty. But some of them are looking at it and saying, wait, this bill takes away my Medicaid. This bill takes away the supplemental nutrition assistance that I rely on. This bill takes away the energy subsidies that are creating the jobs that are revitalizing my community. I may be a good Republican, but that doesn't mean I want my representative voting for this bill. This bill is obviously deeply unpopular with Democrats, but also by far and away the majority, 3-1 of independents oppose this bill. And by the way, again, even the president's immigration agenda, his strong suit, appears to be increasingly unpopular. About a little bit more than a third of Americans approve of it, but more than 50% disapprove of it. This is, of course, sharply polarized along partisan lines, right? And this is looking at whether or not you believe the protesters were peaceful or not. But please note, right, when it comes to the deportations, even a substantial portion of Republicans and especially independents believe that Trump is going too far. He needs to gin up support for his legislative agenda, for his deportation politics, for his tariffs, and he thinks that playing the card of anarchy, violent resistance in Los Angeles will help him to do this. And this gets me then to the final lens through which I want to consider these politics. And that has to do with the growing use of militarized authority to stifle dissent in Trump's second term. I have the Marines deployed in Los Angeles in full combat gear, military vehicles in the background, their automatic rifles in hand. It looks like, if you squint, that could be Iraq or Afghanistan. But no, that's downtown Los Angeles at the federal building, right? And inside that building, you have a United States senator, right, being wrestled to the ground and handcuffed because he dared to ask a question of an administration official and interrupt her in a meeting. Again, democracy is unruly. Democracy does not always proceed via simple civil discourse with those with whom you disagree. It does involve protests. It does involve heated disagreements that sometimes appear to be disrespectful. When it is conducted well, we listen to each other, we learn from each other. When it is conducted poorly, we mistrust each other. When it is in danger, we attempt to suppress dissent. And we do so in part by intimidating those who might be inclined to express it. One way to do that is to display the force of the state, and in particular its military, in contexts where it doesn't normally operate, to deploy the National Guard and the Marines to Los Angeles to parade the military in front of the White House in Washington, D.C. Another way we do this is to tell even the most powerful people in our society. There are only 100 United States senators. We don't care how powerful you are, how much your role is vital to the conduct of democracy in the United States. If you express dissent in ways we don't like, if you criticize us in ways we consider to be disrespectful, we're coming after you, right? We will pin you to the ground and put handcuffs on your back. So my suggestion is that Trump and his administration have thought through the autocrat's playbook. They are pursuing it vigorously and quickly, ruthlessly, and this may be the next chapter. Use militarized force to go after, right, whether it's Democratic politicians, two of whom were shot today, one of whom was, right, arrested or at least handcuffed a few days ago. Gavin Newsom was called new scum by the President of the United States on a social media platform, the governor of the most populous state in the Union. Our civil society actors, right, are being intimidated. That includes the people at the protests, that includes Harvard University, the Associated Press, our law firms. We are seeing the weaponization of the institutions that are central to the rule of law in our society being used not to preserve, but to attack the foundations of our democracy. We're seeing increasing disregard for adverse court decisions. We will have to see. Obviously, there was a very important decision last week that says the Trump administration cannot federalize the National Guard of California. We'll have to see how this plays out. It's been appealed, but I think the more important question than how the appeal goes is whether or not the Trump administration continues to attack the courts and the institution that they preserve the rule of law when the courts try to check and limit its abuse of power. I have a couple quotes I want to leave you with to think about this on the No King's Day. I'll put you first in mind of Thomas Jefferson. And as I've already referred to, right, James Madison in Federalist number 10 says, look, democratic power will have factions. The factions will criticize, will rival, will engage in unruly, contestatory politics. That's the nature of a democracy. If you don't like that, well, you can take freedom away, but that is like using the lack of oxygen to fight a fire. Right? It's not worth the cost. It's addressing something that's dangerous or at least unsavory by doing something that is still more dangerous, taking liberty away. Jefferson, excuse my Latin, says, malo periculosum libertatem quam quietam servitutem. I prefer dangerous freedom over peaceful slavery. And he goes on to say, right, the spirit of resistance to government is so valuable on certain occasions that I wish it to be kept always alive. It will often be exercised when wrong, but better so than not to be exercised at all. I like a little rebellion now and then. It is like a storm in the atmosphere. And if you remember the context, right, he's writing from France, where he's the ambassador, to Abigail Adams, James Madison about Shays' Rebellion. And he's saying, look, I recognize you guys are upset that some farmers took up arms against their state and their federal government when the government was trying to foreclose on their farms. But recognize these people just fought in a rebellion against Britain in order to have politicians who were accountable to them, in order to have democracy, in order to have representation accompanying taxation. Of course they're upset if their government now turns against them. You should want them to engage in rebellion. And please note, what happened in Los Angeles is not rebellion. For the most part, it's in the proud tradition of civil disobedience and resistance to unjust law, to the abuse of power. And much of the provocation, much of the violence is initiated by ICE before it's met by isolated pockets of reciprocal violence from the protesters. Unfortunately, or fortunately, that's part of a well-functioning democracy. Yes, the people who engage in rebellion, the people who engage in violence should be prosecuted, but the Los Angeles police force can manage that. There is no need to have people in fatigues entering an American city to simply perform the theater of violence in order to try to convince portions of the American population that something worse is going on and that we need this level of violence to repress it. This is the path, the well-worn path of Vladimir Putin. This is the well-worn path of other authoritarian leaders like Erdogan or Viktor Orban. And this seems to be a tempting path to the current president of the United States, his administration, and his supporters. One more quotation for you to consider. We've talked together about Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt together. These are the authors of How Democracies Die. They're political scientists at Harvard University. Levitsky and another political scientist, Luke Wei, have also written together. They're actually the ones who coined the term competitive authoritarianism that doesn't try to fully eliminate the opposition, but as opposed to that, tries to make life so difficult for them, to put their real leaders in jail, to take away their funding, to bias the coverage in the media, to control the courts, and in so doing, control the conditions in which politicking takes place, to systematically tilt the playing field against the opposition so that it looks like there was an election. It looks like Vladimir Putin won again. He must be the legitimate leader of our society, right? This is an effort to manufacture legitimacy by going through the motions of democracy when in fact it's authoritarianism. Well, this is what Levitsky, Wei, and Ziblatt said almost exactly a month ago in a long editorial in the New York Times. I encourage you to read it. They say, in democracy, citizens are not punished for peacefully opposing those in power. When citizens must think twice about criticizing or opposing the government because they could credibly face retribution, they no longer live in a full democracy. By that measure, America has crossed the line into competitive authoritarianism. Just pause for a second. That's May 8th, right? Think about the events of the last 10 days with the military rolling into American cities, with senators placed in handcuffs, with elected officials assassinated because of their political views. It is chillingly more so the case a month later than it was when they wrote this. By that measure, America has crossed the line into competitive authoritarianism. Um, the Trump administration's weaponization of government agencies and flurry of punitive actions against critics has raised the cost of opposition for a wide range of Americans. The Trump administration has taken or credibly threatened punitive action against a strikingly large number of individuals and organizations that it considers its opponents. It has, for example, selectively deployed law enforcement agencies against critics. And I put an ellipse in. There's several paragraphs of examples here, which I think we're all familiar with. I don't need to belabor. America has, with stunning speed, descended into a world in which opponents of the government fear criminal investigation, lawsuits, tax audits, and other punitive measures. Civil society must act collectively. And this is where I think the protests of today are so important. The No King's Day protest, the fact that thousands of these occurred all across the United States. Hundreds of thousands or millions of people took to the streets today to join force in saying, no, we did not vote for this. We will not tolerate this. We are not going to be intimidated by this. Levitsky, Way, and Zablak continue. Chief executives, law firms, universities, media outlets, and Democratic politicians, as well as more traditional Republicans, have a common interest in preserving our constitutional democracy. When organizations work together and commit to a collective defense of democratic principles, they share the cost of defiance. The government cannot attack everyone all at once. When the costs of defiance are shared, they become easier for individuals to bear. So on that note, I want to leave it open for you. I know I've shared a lot with you. We have a lot to discuss today, but I do want to point out, right, that this is a crossroads. This is a dangerous moment, and this is an extraordinarily important time for those who have an abiding commitment to the foundational principles of our society to stand up for those principles and to not let the circulation in social media of manufactured emergencies intimidate us into quiescence. That path is the path to 21st century autocracy, and we need to be vigilant in resisting it because it is underway in the United States today. I'll stop there. Who wants to start us out with a question, a thought, a comment? Yes, go ahead. You're still muted.
We just came back from a huge protest in Philadelphia. There must have been about 10,000 people. But
10,000, more like 50,000.
But what I noticed was that many people were masked, and these people were afraid of retribution, of being identified. And that really struck me to find so many people masked.
Yeah. Yeah, I saw some of the pictures from Philadelphia. And by the way, the pictures from all over the United States, they're stunning, right? I mean, you can't accommodate more people in the area in which these protests are occurring. So as I say, encouraged in the literal meaning of that term, we get courage from the fact that so many people are turning out. And yet, we have to recognize, right? We live in the 21st century. And so phone cameras and other ways of taking images are everywhere. And then facial recognition technology is extraordinarily powerful in 2025. And if you went to the protest and your face was uncovered and somebody wants to figure out who you are, it's very easy for them to do. And then if you're young, if you're going to university, if you're worried about applying for a job, or if you're simply worried about somebody using social media tools to profile you, to slander you, to spread malicious information about you, or somebody who's computer savvy getting your private documents and publishing them online, unfortunately, maybe you are well advised to cover your face, right? And I think we just have to recognize that unless and until we begin to do better in regulating social media, artificial intelligence, the tools of surveillance, we live in a world where the ordinary technology that we can use can be weaponized, and in a political environment in which there are a lot of people who want to weaponize it. So yes, the protests were big, and there are a lot of people being cautious. And please note, by the way, that the ICE agents, right, when they go on their raids, they're wearing sunglasses and baseball caps and face masks too, and for similar reasons, right? This is a general problem. Again, in a society in which we had civil discourse and mutual respect, I think we would be much less worried about this. But in a society in which we vilify each other, we dehumanize each other, and we have all of these technological tools with which to do it, people are cautious, understandably. Yeah, I hope it was safe and encouraging to be at the protest in Philadelphia.
It was.
David, you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, am I muted? Unmuted? Yes. Uh, I wanted to say that about the mask. So the problem is that when you see a mask, you're not sure whether to feel sorry for the person or to fear them, because both sides are wearing masks. So that creates a kind of a dilemma to know what a mask means. But I wanted to just say that I think it's great to have these large protests, but having now, this is our fourth small protest out on Piedmont Avenue. And I feel like if we can have more and more small protests like ours uh, all over the place, not just 10,000, but 150,000 of those, that would be equally as important in terms of sending the message. But the real thing I wanted to say is that it seems to me that the lesson here is that violence rhetoric propelled by violent media will eventually lead to violent action. And we have a lesson in spades in that today.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, it's heartbreaking. It is so sad and so awful. And I don't want to, you know, paint too scary or too intimidating a picture. Who knows what we will find when we find this individual, but I suspect we'll find a single sick person, right? And note that there's a long portrait in the New York Times a couple days ago of the man who got within, a millimeter or two of assassinating Donald Trump last summer, right? There are people who are in really terrible shape on both sides, and in an environment in which the rhetoric of mistrust and dehumanization circulates, some of those individuals are going to be pushed around the edge. So I'll leave it there, but I want to come back to what you said at the beginning about lots of small protests, and I just want to amplify. It's not just protests. Protests by themselves are an exercise in preaching to the choir if they don't change the narrative, if they don't make it clear why we're protesting what we're protesting, right? And so the civil rights protests were most successful when they were able to call attention to the level of violence on which the Jim Crow one-party tyranny of the South rested. And when they were able to display the humanity and the dignity of the African American protesters, despite the violence that they were facing. And by the way, they were able to do that because the people who engaged in them weren't just going to protests. They were part of a movement that had sustained organizational capacity, the capacity to train its members to engage in peaceful protest, to keep really large and really complicated protests in line, right? The remarkable thing that you could get 1 million people going to Washington, D.C., and everybody used the porta potties. Right, I mean that's incredible discipline. And then you add, and by the way, they can boycott the buses in Birmingham for a year so that they can bring the public transportation system of a major southern city to the brink of bankruptcy, right? When you generate that kind of capacity, you really begin to say to the political elite, you have to recognize that we are a power to be reckoned with, and protests alone do not convey that. You need
Sure.
organization, and that involves more than going to protests. That involves going to meetings, going to trainings, reaching out to people, building that capacity. And I feel like today we should absolutely be encouraged by the right, outpouring of people into the streets to say, not in my name, stop. This is not what we want from our government. But frankly, Donald Trump and the Republican Party will use this to fan the flames of political animosity if we are not able to then use it to change the narrative, to say the people you are deporting are people on whom we all rely and who are here, many of them, for very good reasons, in part because our immigration system is broken, in part because our economy needs them, in part because they're in harm's way where they come from. And so that capacity to change the narrative, I worry that we may not be all the way there yet. And the capacity to say, and by the way, we have the power to stand up. We're not going to be intimidated. Going to the protest is the start, but it's not the ultimate demonstration. We know that Donald Trump reacts to defeat by becoming all the more vindictive and ruthless and bullying. If it rains on his parade tonight, if he faces all of these setbacks in court, if there are people in the streets in Los Angeles making it hard for his administration to deport the people it wants to deport, I don't think he's simply going to back down. And so we have to be prepared, and we have to keep building the capacity, and we have to recognize that part of the problem here is that the Democratic Party has been so ineffective as a legislative force at addressing the profound vulnerabilities of so many Americans who turn to Donald Trump in desperation. So if we want to produce a more effective Democratic Party, again, we need to not just go to protests. We need to be organized in ways that say, pay attention to our interests, to our ideas, or else you will not get our votes. And to bring our party into the forefront of being a progressive force for our country. Flossie, I saw you waving a few minutes ago. Did you have something you wanted to share with us? You're muted right now, so you'd have to unmute. Go ahead. No, still muted. Sorry. Is there anybody else while Flossie's working on this?
I could just add one more quick thing.
Yeah.
Uh, Another thing that we can do, we're not all as physically active as we once were, but we can direct any spare change we have to uh, efforts that combat where we are. And I've decided that the legal uh, battles with the court is a good place to make an investment. So I've upped my contributions to like ACLU and a couple of other outfits that have strong legal efforts going on right now.
Yeah, Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund might be one. MALDEF, for instance. 5051 would be another place, right? Flossie, go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I was ready to march, except that home health, who comes to bandage me, was supposed to be here at 9 o'clock and called in to say by the time we could reach them that they hadn't arrived, that the demonstration was keeping home health from getting to their commitments to the people who were waiting to receive them so that they could have their wounds dressed or whatever. At any rate, I am so much aware of how dangerous it is to name names or even think of names. For example, and I hope you laugh with me, when I saw, pardon me, George Clooney
Mm.
make his address before he reenacted Edward R. Murrow, I was so impressed with his majesty. First of all, he's gorgeous, but that's beside the point. But the way he spoke to us as an American, not as an actor, as an American, putting himself in the possibility of being a target, because a nut like me would say, oh, if we could have him for president, just to utter that idea is to start the wheels turning. So I withdraw it. I wish him all the good luck in his house and his life and his Iranian wife. But if we do anything with his attractiveness, we have somebody watching to pop him or to pop someone. It's dangerous, but it was also dangerous for Renee Stapleton to take my place in the march and say I'm Flossie. So Renee, forgive me. I'm Flossie. You're in, but you stood in, and I thank you. But I was there.
And I will say bon courage, as they say in French, but also very quickly, right? You know, George Clooney strikes me as the 21st century Cary Grant, right? He's someone who's so profoundly good looking that he has a certain charisma before he opens his mouth, and then he's doing wonderful stuff. But let me go back to what you said at the very beginning, Flossie, and just note that one of the ways in which autocracy works, and this comes out in the Levitsky ways, a Blatt quotation that I read from you, is by spreading fear and intimidation, right? And I think, right, you know, Lisa Murkowski says we are all scared now. And she means all the members of the Senate. When Donald Trump releases dangerous thugs from jail, when he engages in puerile rhetoric, in the worst kind of violent intimidation from the bully pulpit of the Oval Office, yes, we're rightfully scared. When Harvard University is put in harm's way, when Elon Musk, the richest man in the world, has his government contracts threatened, etc. We recognize that the President of the United States knows no bounds in his ruthlessness. And demands complete submission to his will. This is not the disposition of a person who should be a Democratic president. We're in this for the long haul. We've got 3.5 years, right? And so we're going to have to marshal our resources, maintain our vigilance, maintain our courage, and yes, rationally protect ourselves from the real threat that this man and these circumstances represent. So these are tricky times. I'll just say again, I'm really happy to be in conversation with all of you as we face down these dangers. It helps, I think, to build the community and the understanding and the courage that we need. Thank you all for what you did today. Thank you for being with me this afternoon. Be well. I'll see you next weekend. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure as always. Take care. See you guys soon.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.